Welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast, bringing you the stories of many people who in various ways are attempting to walk the path of yoga. Our intention is to inspire your own practice and commitment to yoga beyond the mat and in all areas of life. We consider this an offering, a service to the community and labour of love. If you feel inclined, any donations are appreciated. Just visit our page and click the donate button at www.keenonyoga.co.uk/podcast. I hope you enjoy the show. Today's guest on the Keen on Yoga podcast is Joey Miles. Joey started in 1998 after a background growing up pursuing circus, martial arts and physical theatre. He calls it a misspent youth. Whilst at Goldsmiths studying for his BA in drama, he started the Yoga Society there, and around that time he also started Ashtanga Yoga London with Hamish Hendry. From graduating, he began assisting Hamish at the Yoga School of London, where he did so for 3 years along with practicing daily with Hamish. 2004, he was authorised to teach the primary series by Pattabhi Jois and taught a daily Mysore programme at the well-known triyoga in London between 2005 and 2008. 2009, he's relocated to Hebden Bridge in the north of England and set up Ashtanga Yoga Leeds. 2014, he's completed the Advanced A series in Mysore, which is a unique and well-respected accomplishment. And other than that, Joey is a lover of music and dance, a well-loved personality, a unique and engaging and enthusiastic teacher, as well as friend. Welcome to the Keen on Yoga podcast, Joey.
Lovely to have you. You just want to just tell us how you first got into yoga? Just a little intro.
I first got into yoga when I was about 17 years old, so I was quite young.
Right.
I was already doing physical theatre, and I've been quite involved in circus arts. So I did a lot of juggling, and I've been exposed to circus artists and physical theatre people who did sort of warm-up routines and physical or physicality type routines. So I'd been exposed to some of that and was aware it had value. And I was also keen to make some changes in my life because when I was quite young, I was quite hedonistic, and that's a bit of a euphemism. I mean, I had a bit of a drug problem when I was young, and I was keen to stop that. I had a few run-ins and a few near misses. I also had a couple of close friends who one went to prison for a short time, and another ended up in section. So I had issues. So I had enough of it, and just enough stuff to think, right, I should do something. And I'm not quite sure why. I mean, I've alluded to the fact that I was exposed to it through circuits, but in the beginning, I'm trying to think, it was the late 90s, and I'm sure there were yoga classes about, but I was just a teenage boy in Oxford, and I wasn't really exposed to them. So I started from a book. So I spent a year practicing on my own from a book. Frankly, I didn't know my arse from my elbow. And I was shocked, because you see a diagram in a book and you try to do, I don't know, something as simple as Shalabhasana, and you're like, oh my God, I'm stuck on the floor here. So that's how I started. I did a year, and very quickly I started to feel tremendously well, like really tremendously well. I didn't feel so lonely. I didn't feel so sort of lost. I loved the health benefits or the physical benefits of being able to stretch my leg a few inches further. I liked that because I could see it. But
I think the funny thing is, we're probably, because I did the same thing for a book. I think I had Light on Yoga. I don't know what book yours was. And I can only imagine, well, you might not have been, but I would have been doing these shapes terribly. Probably absolutely terribly. But yet, and I think it's worth remembering as teachers, like when we're assuming that we ought to kind of instruct correctly per se, or, actually you get so much benefit and a health benefit and mental benefit, even if you're doing the shapes rubbishly.
Yeah. Well, for me, it went hand in hand. I used to wake up in the morning and smoke first thing in the morning. And then having smoked, I would meet my friends at the park and we would all smoke before going to school.
Cigarette or joint?
No, other stuff. And then, and then instead I was waking up at 6 a.m. and doing some yoga for an hour. And then I was like, right, that's good. And it was like my way of stopping getting high all the time from first thing in the morning. So I'd started the day in kind of a different frame of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And from that age, I think it was the last 6 months of A-levels, whatever it was, it became my sort of discipline, structure. And then, frankly, from then, I mean, it sounds a bit dramatic to say I turned my life around, but things really did change for me very quickly from that point. And a year later, when I was at Goldsmiths at university, I was exposed to some quite good teaching. And that was when I was exposed to learning Surya Namaskar and a sort of abbreviated method of Ashtanga that worked quite well for me. But again, for the next 2 years, I wasn't doing Mysore style. I wasn't being told that I couldn't do more poses because I hadn't learned that one. I didn't even know about that. Sort of. In the beginning, I just sort of got told to do, Jhana Shashasana followed by Marichyasana A and then C, a kind of short forms type practice.
Yeah.
And it wasn't.
And that was, you were doing drama at university, right?
Yeah, I was doing drama and theatre. Mm-hmm. I loved that. I mean, I really loved the whole kind of performative element. And for me, in the beginning, yoga was very much linked to my drive was I'd like to be a good performer. I could see the physicality of good actors, and I wanted to do that.
That's not uncommon in the yoga world generally, I'd say, these days. Performance in yoga. And you that's strange. You started, that reminds me of a spectator-led second class in Mysore. The watching from the door in the led intermediate, a yoga performance.
I see what you mean. I couldn't follow. I was like, what?
Yeah. Well, remember when you're doing a lead intermediate in Mysore, people are watching, and you kind of feel that you're almost doing a performance, rightly or wrongly.
To be honest, I used to like that. I mean, I don't do it enough, but I still participate and have done for a long time with 5 Rhythms, the dance practice.
Do you? Well,
sorry,
you were part of the Tripsikori, weren't you? In the
no, I was never.
No, you didn't do that. You didn't do that. It was a yoga kind of what was Tripsikori? A yoga theatre thing in London, wasn't it? Essentially, I don't know whether it's still around.
What I was trying to allude to in the 5 Rhythms practice is there's a simple practice where they say take a partner, and then you watch your partner dancing. I mean, you're kind of dancing at the side. You're watching, but you're giving them all your attention. And then so there's basically a big room of dancers. There's a circle of people, and they're looking at one person on the inside. And then you partners and you switch. The truth is, I mean, it's probably obvious, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this podcast with you. The truth is, I like being watched. I've actually quite liked the attention. I mean, I'm just being honest.
That's fair enough. Do you?
And I'm very aware that people don't like that. They feel exposed, but I've always rather liked it. I quite enjoyed that element of it.
Right.
So although people used to sort of moan a bit about, well, you're slightly alluding to it, it's a shame when yoga becomes a performance, and it's a different thing. But I've never particularly been too bothered about showing people stuff.
And then how did that kind of performance become something else? Or, how did it evolve into your finding Ashtanga yoga and, getting into, I think you assisted Hamish for a number of years in Ashtanga London, right? And then you taught it.
I was still an undergraduate at Goldsmiths.
Right.
And I went to a couple of workshops, at first with John Scott, but he was not in London anymore. And having done a few workshops with John, he said to me, you must go to Hamish. And I had heard that Hamish was full and that you couldn't go. And to be honest, I'd never particularly thought about going into central London. I mean, Goldsmiths was in East London, so I didn't feel like going into central. Anyway, but when John told me pretty certainly, in that way that some teachers can, you should do that. He's like, you must go to... So I phoned Hamish and he just said, well, come every day. Come at whatever time suits you, 7 o'clock, I think he said. And then pretty quickly, I mean, I just loved the atmosphere at Hamish's. I loved the intensity. Before Hamish's, I went to Jenny and Sibel, but that was just at the weekend.
All right.
And I like being with men doing yoga. I know that might sound odd, but when I first did yoga at Goldsmiths, I was in a class with about 30, 40 women, and there'd be me.
Right.
If I was lucky, there'd be one other guy.
I thought you would have liked that as part of it.
But there was a
part of your performance.
Say again?
I thought you'd have liked that as part of your performance. the adulation of the women as well.
No, I didn't.
No, you didn't.
I enjoyed. I did also martial arts back then, and I enjoyed the camaraderie of men in the changing rooms doing Aikido, and I enjoyed all that aspect of the social side of going to
right,
like Aikido and so. And I missed that a little bit in classes that were just women. Anyway, when I went to Jenny and Sibel's, just simple things like I've never taken, since doing Ashtanga yoga classes, I hadn't taken my t-shirt off. It felt inappropriate somehow. But at Jenny and Sibel's, it was like, oh, look, the men just take their t-shirts off, which, as you know, when you're dripping with sweat, seems the most natural thing to do. It's probably what you do at home. So I liked that feeling of just, I don't know, it felt right. Also, I'd come from rave culture, I'd come from techno parties and drum and bass parties, and I like that kind of sweaty underground basement room kind of. It felt a bit dark and underground, and yeah, I felt very at home as soon as I went into that environment. I liked it, and then I was still an undergraduate. So then, having finished my degree, in fact, it was before I finished. Hamish suggested that I assist him, and I thought that was sort of chance of a lifetime. Which, if I'm honest, it was. I mean, I owe Hamish a lot. He taught me an awful lot. And it was a great place to learn by observing bodies and being shown what to do. And I had a sort of beautifully, if I'm honest, I was a good beginner back then. I didn't overthink it. I just did what I was told. I had total faith in it, and I just, got on with it. I was only 21 when I was Hamish.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so that worked really well for me for a number of years, very, very well. Yeah, and I didn't particularly, I can't say I gave it a great deal of thought. I just sort of fell into it. It was an accident. I didn't,
right.
I hadn't thought about it. I was finishing my degree, got asked to do this thing, thought, well, that's great. Started doing it. And then quite quickly, people like Jonathan at Triyoga were asking me to teach quite regularly. And that was great. But I realized I was out of my depth, and I realized then there was about an entire lifetime of study involved if I was going to take the responsibility seriously, which I would say I still do. So, I realized, in the beginning, it was London in whatever it was, 2002 or something. And because it looked on the outside like I could do some of these yoga shapes, I was told to show other people how to do them. And I did, and I think I was adequate at it, but I also look back and, think I was perhaps a bit naive or, ill-informed. So I slowly started to, or not slowly, I quite rigorously started to study with other people.
You were teaching the Mysore at Triyoga before you'd been to Mysore itself, or?
No, I've been to Mysore 3 times. I've got authorised to teach.
Right.
Only when I got authorised to teach did I then go off to run the Mysore class at Triyoga. In the beginning, I was a bit more traditional in my approach. I was like, right, do it properly, get my stripes. So, I did that, and that worked well for me. But when I was at Triyoga, because Triyoga has always had that deal, which is teachers can join in with other teachers' class very cheap, I did start to do a lot of... I did just practice with lots of different people. And it was there that I met Alaric, who's been probably my sort of biggest influence after the structure of the Ashtanga practice.
Right. And that's the Iyengar. That's the Iyengar. Right.
He's a very senior Iyengar teacher, and he's been my teacher now, probably my central teacher for the last 15 years.
Right. Are you still practicing with him?
Yeah.
Right.
I still practice with him quite regularly.
Perhaps we'll go and on in a minute to make a little kind of comparison of the two methods. But first of all, can you just tell us a bit about your experiences in Mysore, how you found it, what your experiences of the tradition are, and maybe what you feel about it now. I trust now you're also exploring other modalities as well. How you kind of sync those early experiences into your current teaching, just to give people kind of overview of where you're at with Mysore.
Early experience, my experience of Mysore almost entirely has been extremely positive. I first went, like I say, I was in my early 20s. I went for 3 months on the first trip and I had a fantastic time. I just loved it. I enjoyed everything about it. I enjoyed, making friends with people who could just hang out and have lunch. I mean, it's like hang out at a coconut stand. I mean, what's not to like? I read an awful lot of novels and I went to chanting class. And on some of the other trips, I did various painting classes. I took up artistic hobbies and hung out with people. Or later, I quite quickly took my children to Mysore. I had kids when I was quite young. I took the kids to Mysore 3 times over the years. I would say I went from, at first it was like, oh, okay, I'm sort of joining in and going through fairly quickly and all that. And I did get pushed through quite quickly because, you see, Sharah knew I was being taught by Hamish. So Sharah treats different people in rather different ways. It's very hard to understand, or it's impossible, I would say, to understand why some people he wants to move through very slowly and other people very quick. But he did move through me quite quickly. But to be honest, I was quite young and capable, so that sort of makes sense. But I would say that was really positive. And then when I took the children again, that was lovely, really, because, when the kids were little, I wasn't practicing, but I was practicing a lot less, because when you're juggling working and just having young kids and so on, practice takes a bit of a back seat of your priorities, a bit like it is now. I've got a little one again. Anyway, but being in Mysore, I'd go very early to practice, look after the kids. Then my ex-wife at the time, Donna, she would go and practice, and it felt like that was making up the structure of your day. It has to be said, it's a very taxing and it's not a good choice of word. It's a very demanding, it requires a lot of discipline, as you know, to do this practice. So by being in Mysore, you're there to practice. It becomes the center of your day. Everything is kind of built around that morning ritual. And as a result, you don't get too distracted. And again, in the early days when I was in Mysore, I don't think I even used the internet once. I didn't have a phone. It was a very sort of simple life, and it was quite a different time. In fact, when I was first in Mysore, it was just when they'd opened the new Sharah. And I don't know if you remember these days, but Mysore was on hydroelectricity. I don't know if it still is. And the lights would go out. Nearly all the lights would go out at about 6 p.m. And we'd light a candle, and we wouldn't even read a book. We'd have a cup of herbal tea and chat with whoever it was we were living with, And, it was like, right, that's it, bed by.
Yeah.
It was like, literally, there's no electricity. I mean, it did change because in the last few times I went to Mysore, where you can get on the internet.
I think it's
whole sets. It's a bit different.
Latterly, it was like when I kind of last time I went, it was like, where is everyone? And then everyone, once everyone's got on the internet, and to watch all these box sets and stuff, it's like no one was at the coconut stand anymore. No one was hanging out with each other anymore. Everyone was at home, kind of, just trying to recover after practice.
But for me, the other thing that's happened is I've had different Mysore trips. I think I've done 7, which isn't that many, but anyway, I've done about 7. And there were times when I was on my own, totally on my own, not with the kids, and I was just in maybe for a month. And I really did act like a sort of hermit or, a monk, and I would just seal myself into doing yoga, walking at the lake, doing a lot of meditation, really living a very austere kind of way. But at other times I've been in Mysore and it's just been a hangout with friends, So it's been very different, the trips. There were times when the kids were young and it felt lovely to be part of a community of other young parents hanging out at the pool with other kids. There were some very idyllic times. And then there have also been times which, you know what it's like. It's just different periods of your life reflect.
Sure, yeah. And
I've also been through various emotional upheavals. I mean, I was there just as my life was falling apart. So I was getting divorced, and that came as a bit of a shock. So, there are times when I've been there and, things have been on the outside, extremely turbulent.
Yeah. How do you kind of find assimilating or practicing alongside kind of raising a family? Because I haven't done that. And, I can imagine that, as you said, practice takes a back seat. Does the practice help, or do you have to put that aside, or is there any? Well, can you say anything about this experience?
The truth is, I can't say a lot about it because I don't know. I don't know any different. I mean, I was 25 when I had Caleb, and 26 when I had my daughter Daisy, and then just recently Rosa was born just a couple of months ago. It's very different now having a baby, and I'm 39 compared to when I was 25. But also, I'm much more settled now. I'm here in my own home. I'm not going anywhere. The first few years when I had children, I was moving in London from one flat to another flat to another flat, like renting different places, being kicked out at the end of a lease and finding. So that was unsettling. But the truth is, because I had that initial training with Hamish and then with Pattabhi Jois in Mysore, my practice has nearly always been, well, set your alarm for 4 a.m., just get up and get on with it. So although when the kids were young, my first two, although when they were young and I was somewhat sleep deprived and tired, I would still basically get up and get on with it. And
because you could when you were young.
But the way that changed was because I was studying with Alaric, this Iyengar teacher. I started to do, which is more of a classic change, is I would do longer inversions. You can see the ropes behind me in the studio. I would do rope Shirshasana or chair Savangasana. I would do much longer inversions. I would also do a lot more, I never did this before, supine poses. And those poses I did find incredibly helpful when I was tired. I still find them incredibly helpful. If I'm tired now, I don't impose this sense of a 6-day routine to practice. I mean, I basically practice every day, but there'll be days when I'm just lying on bolsters or just doing supine poses or just inversions and supine. So I'm not too fixed in my approach. But you see, there were times when I was in Mysore and I went to Sharah in the office and I said, I've woken up with a very crooked neck. My daughter was sleeping next to me and I've only had broken sleep and, I was on the sofa or whatever, and I was like, I'll just do primary today, I said to Sharah, and he just said, just do your normal practice, quite firmly to me, which was, I think at the time it was second and half of third series. I remember walking out of the office thinking, damn, I shouldn't have asked. I should have just done primary. Because if I hadn't asked, he wouldn't have stopped me doing just primary. But I, for some reason, thought, I'll just make that suggestion, And then, but he told me to do that. To be fair, I did it. It was fine. I felt better for having just got. So there are times when I've really kind of admired or appreciated Sharah's kind of holding the bar high and telling me, just get on with it, which he's done pretty much the whole time I've ever been with him. It's like, just get on with it.
What would you say to students on that level then? I mean, obviously...
I would never say that to students. I would never say that.
No.
Right. Right. You go easy today, mate. You take it easy, Follow you. Yeah.
Or if someone says they're tired to you, would you say, just get your feet up against the wall, take it easy? Or because it's a tough one, isn't it? When to kind of encourage someone,
It's not tough. No, you see, for me, it's not tough.
You don't think so? Okay.
But for me, I find generally I relish the prospect of teaching people some supine poses, something that's going to be taking it easy. If my regular students are doing primary series or whatever it is in their Ashtanga series, I relish the opportunity to teach them something more supportive. So I don't find it too hard. I feel it's really helpful to be able to have that in your palette or in your repertoire, that you can do these gentler practices or more supportive. I wouldn't even use the word gentler. I think that's a bit misleading. I mean, I remember hearing Alaric saying, and I don't want to misquote him on this, but he said something along the lines of he spent at least a year at one point, or maybe longer, doing just restorative practice. And then he jokingly said, bear in mind that my restorative practice looks more dynamic than a lot of you on a dynamic day, And I think that's one of the things you have to remember. If you saw me doing restorative practice, it might be 4 hours of a long Iyengar yoga sequence. It's not easy, It's quite... it's something that you have to be very well trained to do. It's not like you're just sleeping in the corner. I think that's worth bearing in mind.
What are the benefits of restorative practice, or how would you define that?
I suppose you could define it as you take 2 trees and you put one tree in a sheltered greenhouse and you give it all the water and the nutrients it needs and you see how it grows. and you expose the other tree, like outside here is the ragged Pennine Hills in some, and you see how the two trees do. It's like the one that's more supported is going to flourish, it's going to bloom, it's going to look very different. I have a courtyard just outside this house here where there's an Acer tree that's been growing for the last 5 or 6 years. It's gone from a very small bush to this really beautiful looking small tree. So, I mean, obviously that's the metaphor, but when I'm supported, I feel I can relax and rest, and I feel well. I mean, it's as basic as that. I feel energized and well when I'm supported. And the other reason I champion this kind of method to practice is there are times in my life when I've either been fatigued or psychologically agitated, stressed out, and to jump around and do such a dynamic practice as, the Pattabhi Jois sequences, the Ashtanga method kind of entails. There are times when that just doesn't suit me. It either doesn't suit my temperament or it leaves me feeling fried. An obvious example is if I'm actually teaching retreats, which I do quite a bit. If I'm teaching retreats and have quite a busy schedule and I'm looking after a larger group of students, it gets either at the beginning, maybe I've been traveling, or towards the end and I'm feeling somewhat depleted. Then when I'm doing, and it's not dissimilar to the primary series sequence actually, but if I'm doing restorative forward bends and I've supported the forehead, and for me, because I've done so much back arching over the years, I have to support this part of my middle back, so there's bolsters in the front and so on, blankets at the front supporting me. There's it has a completely different effect, and I feel that's extremely healing. It's been extremely healing, supportive. I can't.
Is that not an argument for doing it all the time then? I mean, just supportive practice.
No, it's really not. And this is
right.
No, because if I did that all the time, it would leave me feeling sluggish, dull, heavy. It's like now, I might want to go out for a walk, and that might on some days turn into a, long hike. But many days I just want to stroll down the canal. There'll be days when I don't go outside at all, and pretty quickly I'll feel like, man, I need to get out and have some fresh air. I don't think it's very different. Me taking a walk down the canal for 40 minutes with my daughter, or for me going for a hike through the woods, all afternoon, those are quite different things. And I think spontaneously when you want to have more fresh air, be outside for longer. It's similar with practice. I like doing the dynamic structure of the practice that I learned in Mysore. I have 3 sequences. I like to work on those. But I also like during the week, or depending on the schedule, I like to be able to add in a more restorative practice.
And do you teach like that to students now?
Say that again.
Do you teach like that to students? Are you kind of balancing the practices?
If I'm structuring weekends, like a weekend workshop, I try to always include either the last practice or sometimes the beginning practice. It's the same, isn't it? If people have travelled on a Friday night, then actually to do a slower start. Or if people are about to travel again off on Sunday afternoon, I tend to always, the way the Iyengas do, or the way the Iyengar school and teachers often do a sort of more dynamic morning practice and a more supported afternoon practice, I tend to follow that now in a teaching schedule. So that's, or in my practice a lot, that's what I would do as well. I would do that in the morning, and then if I have time later in the day, I'll do a more supported practice or a longer inversions practice.
When you say supported, that kind of brings me to the mind of this idea of perhaps facilitating a more appropriate holding or sense of, alignment of the structure of the skeleton. What is the benefit, would you say? I mean, obviously you've sought that attitude towards your postures within the teaching of the Iyengar system as well.
I can't teach the Iyengar system. I know it's a tiny point, but I do not teach. I can't say I teach.
No, you're not teaching it. But to the degree you're interested in that alignment.
In a huge part.
So I suppose my kind of roundabout way was asking what is the benefit of aligning the postures in the first place? I mean, you learnt in Ashtanga London first of all under the classic method, which is more just simply breathing, vinyasa, and doing, and then, extracting another perspective, which is a more particular aligned effect. What are the benefits of each one in your mind? And where do you fall?
I mean, I hugely value alignment. These days I value alignment. It's like when I first learned yoga, I was just learning from a book and doing it in a very haphazard way. Then I learned it sort of all over again. And at Hamish's, he basically taught me, it felt like I learned it all over again. At Hamish's, he taught me, well, he let me do primary series, but then he taught me second series pose by pose in that very traditional format. Then I went to Mysore itself, where again I did primary for the first month, and then I learned pose by pose through second and then through third series pose by pose. So it felt like, although Hamish had taught me, I had to learn it again under Sharah's eye. Now, actually, when I was being watched by Hamish, I felt supported. I felt held and supported by Hamish. I always felt he had his eye on me and was looking after me. So I felt held. When I learned with Sharah, I wouldn't say I felt quite as nurtured and held as by Hamish. I didn't have such a close relationship or a close sense of trust, partly just because of the scale of the size of the students and so on. But I still felt held by that container. Now, what Mr. Iyengar did, as far as my understanding is he looked around at his growing number of students and he couldn't physically support them all. So he was using bricks and chairs and what have you to actually be able to support everybody at the same time. So now for me, if I'm using whatever it is, the prop, I can support myself with the prop. And the first thing that does is it enables me to stay in a pose for longer. Now, when I stay in a pose for longer, that just allows me to process more information of what is moving where, or which part of my body is not participating, or where I could say the awareness isn't penetrating. So normally I have awareness in the beginning in some major gross part of the body, and that is often a part of the body which might even be straining or overworking. So the support will allow me to pacify that area, and hopefully, and on a good day, or over a period of time, it will allow me to then work the area which isn't getting involved. So and that changes everything really. So I first felt like I learned, like I said, with Hamish. Then when I learned with Alaric, again, I went right back to the basics of, he was saying to me, that's really not, you're not getting the right directionality in dog pose, or you're collapsing the lumbar. That's not the right directionality of the tailbone in Trikonasana. That's not. And at first, and the other thing you see I loved in the Iyengar method, and this is very different, is they demonstrate and they show a student doing the pose, and they ask you, can you see X, Y, or Z? And in the beginning, even though I was already teaching in a Mysore room, I did not know what they were referring to. I could not see the directionality of the skin in a particular place. Or, I genuinely didn't know what he was talking about. And quite quickly over time, I could start to first see in the demonstration what was changing. And then, it basically prod me enough that over time. But also, that's it really. So, I mean, what that did though is it makes me incredibly attuned and aware of what I'm doing. Whereas, this because your experience, it's like you might look at me gliding on through primary series and somebody might notice the floating through and the floating back and think, that looks like a lovely advert for yoga. But actually I'm fretting about, I don't know, whatever I'm stressed about. Do you know what I mean? I can be really distracted and you might not know. When you look at me, you probably would know if I'm, but you might not. I mean, actually I've done it so many times, I could make it look like I'm, quite calm and focused, and actually I'm not. What I liked with Alaric is he's also a psychotherapist. So he would use this different type of language, or not even different, but he would use a more nuanced language than I had heard in a Mysore room. And he would be saying, Joey, you're agitated, come down. And I thought, how does he know I'm agitated? But he was just looking at the furrow of my eyebrows or the biting of my lip or something quite clear. Or maybe he could see some strain, in some muscle quivering. So he would just say, you're agitated, come down. And there was no two ways about it. It was like, he's right, I'm agitated. So I enjoyed the directness. It wasn't it wasn't, you've got the bind, now do the next one, keep the challenge going. It was much more like, come back, you haven't got Parivrtta Trikonasana, you know.
Of understanding it, there's some kind of benefit of aligning to some further degree of internal aligning.
Yeah, but it's also, for me, it's just about, it's participating, isn't it? I mean, there's a phrase which I've heard quite a bit lately, which is, you know, your mind might be distracted. Well, then you just give it something to do. It's like when my but they're older now, they're teenagers, but when my kids were at the Steiner School, I used to sometimes see the teacher, who I thought was great, work with quite difficult kids. And those kids who are quite difficult, who might be quite disruptive, they always seem to give that kid something special, like they give that kid a special job. You know, I really need you to sit with me and do this thing. And you watch that kid feel involved and enjoy being in the class. And it didn't matter that they were doing something maybe different to the other kids. Well, when I'm practicing yoga, sometimes my mind can behave a bit like that, you know, slightly naughty school child, to use that analogy. So I just have to give my mind something to do. It has to participate. So I make my mind participate by checking the heels, the inner, the outer, checking, you know, the outer hips, are they pinning in? Checking, is the coccyx moving to the heel, or has it disappeared? Is it, you know, is it not participating in the pose? So for me, it very much is about getting my mind to participate, moving through these body parts. And then, you know, that really, for me, that really changes things. And what I notice is when I try and drive that type of teaching through to students, on the whole, it works quite well. I mean, there are also times when you just want to let that go and get on with it. You know, so the opposite of that is, frankly, just speeding up. You know, if you're doing quite a fast, counted primary series, that's a very different thing. You don't have to keep doing it endlessly. But as a stage of practice, I think it can work very well for a number of years. I mean, it's still working for me very well.
And you don't find it takes the emphasis off the kind of mind control in a kind of Patanjalian way and put it back into the body?
No, I think it's just a different,
right.
I don't think it's just a different interpretation. I exactly the same. I really see no difference. I mean, there was a time when I was a student of Hamish and John's, and then obviously Pattabhi Jois and Sharah, and I was doing my best to count the number of vinyasa. I use that as a method to, you know, okay, I'm distracted, I'll go to counting. But then it got to a point where counting felt a little bit, I don't know, it's like, I mean, I used to sit with Buddhist groups who would say, okay, meditate, count the breath. That's a fantastic way to start meditating, focusing on the breath. Your mind has wandered, you come back to the counting. But then you stop doing that quite quickly and you just focus on the flow and the sensation of the breathing. The counting is quite an early stage. My view these days with Ashtanga personally is that, yeah, it's great to count 5 breaths in the pose. It's great to maybe, you know, count the vinyasa when you're learning it so that you've got this sense of an understanding of the system. But you don't keep doing that. I mean, I play guitar, so I might count 1, 2, 3, 4 and begin. And then I might count through in the 12-bar blues, you know, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3 and 4 and change and 2 and 3 and 4. But once you've been around that kind of circular song a few times, you just know, you feel and you change in the right place, or I generally do. You know, it's like, of course, if you're distracted. So actually this analogy of music and then just feeling it, it's kind of, that's how it works for me now when I'm practicing a rhythm of a sequence. I just feel it and change. I feel it. Yeah. Now I like going back and doing a counted class when, you know, Sharah's leading, or, you know, actually these days I join in with a number of different teachers just through YouTube or whatever and go, oh, that's good. And then I always pick something up. I'm like, oh, I've been sloppy here. Oh, I've been speeding up there. So I find that quite useful. I just wouldn't want to practice like that all the time.
So along those lines, what are the benefits of tradition then, vis-a-vis kind of learning it, learning the counting, learning the, you know, and then spreading out to, you know, freestyle, essentially, doing what's right for you, you know, developing a practice for yourself, you know, I
kind of think that's probably where most of us are going. I mean, my guess is if you watch me practice throughout the week, you know, which you don't have to do. But like, if you were to watch that, I mean, I don't know if you'd call it Ashtanga. You know, it depends how you use the term. For me, I use the term Ashtanga a bit more loosely. I try to use the terminology, the Pattabhi Jois sequences. But, you know, I don't personally see Iyengar yoga as anything other than a different form of Patanjali's Ashtanga yoga. It's the same, you know, with these Ashtanga sequences. It's the same with lots of other, for me personally. So in terms of all I can say, what I got is I got a great sense of structure and also discipline from the kind of fairly traditional approach. I still think of myself, if I'm honest, I mean, I know other people would disagree, but I still think of myself as quite traditional, to be honest. I genuinely do. I realise other people think I'm quite non-traditional because I like to support people with props and so on. But I still see it as a very traditional format. I mean, my view is always just I want to support and encourage and help the people who are there and who I'm working with. And I'll just use what method that I see fit at the time. Obviously, there are drawbacks to this. The main one being if I'm mixing around too many methods and showing people too many different things too soon, then maybe they just leave feeling confused. If I've given them too many options, which I've certainly done sometimes, made mistakes along the way, then people go, oh, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I mean, in my own practice, I wouldn't say I normally feel like I don't know what to do, but there are definitely days where there's a doubt or a hesitation. You know, should I practice this series or that series? Or because I've got, I don't know, some strain or soreness from yesterday's enthusiastic practice, should I just go back to, you know, a gentle restorative sequence? So that can be tricky to gauge. I think that's, I think that's the, you know, I think that can be tricky for people. But you could say the same thing about somebody who's learned intermediate series. When should they do intermediate? When should they do primary? You know, are they only supposed to do primary on Friday? Do you really think
there's definite injunctions around it, isn't there? And is there any benefit from these ideas that are floating around about, you know, surrendering to the tradition or, you know, respecting the tradition rather than just deciding, well, I feel better holding the toe or the side of the foot, so
I think
I'll do that.
People have to trust in their process. I genuinely believe it's true that what we're engaging in, if we're engaging in yoga as sort of spiritual practice, and we have, you know, an intention of aiming for the highest, we could say, you know, if we're not just doing it for kind of fairly materialistic pursuits, then you do have to have trust in the process. You do have to have trust that you're on a path. I mean, my path and process doesn't look the same as yours and doesn't look the same as plenty of other people's. I mean, if some people's process is they're going to, you know, adhere to the exact way that on this day they do this sequence and on that day they do that sequence, and then, you know, then that's fine. Some people, that's their process, and I think that's wonderful. For me, I view that process as almost it seems too ascetic to me. It doesn't allow me a sense of autonomy, I suppose. You know, I want, at the end of the day, to trust my own instincts, my own sense. And I do. I have that sense of trust. And I suppose, well, not, yeah, I do. I trust in my teachers who come from several different traditions. And I also trust that I'll know what to do when I'm practicing. And I feel I do know that, you know, I don't think it's that complex. It's like I think children know when to stop eating. They just know when they're full. I think it gets a bit harder when you're an adult sometimes to know if you're full or if you're not, or, you know, but really I think hopefully it should be as natural as that. You know, I've had enough, I'll stop. Now, I've seen very, you know, traditional teachers tell people to stop much sooner, and they would only then start again with, you know, the structure of the Pattabhi Jois sequences, and that's fine. I mean,
so you're not a teacher that stop people if you can't bind in Richasana D, you can't go any further. I mean, how do you feel about
I've done that. For me, I can't really say as a generalized thing what I would do.
Right.
Just depend on the student. For some students, I might see that they're really enthusiastic and capable, and I might try and hold them back. And the purpose of that is obviously discipline, boundaries. You know, I mean, it's about teaching somebody boundaries, isn't it? Which is great. I mean, I loved being held back by Hamish in the beginning because it was like, oh, okay, he's telling me what to do. That's great. You know, I liked that. Again, Alaric was holding me back. You know, no, I don't want you to take the toe. I want you to come back high. You know, in actual pose, he'd pull me right back to contain it. He said to me, you know, I'm going to try and make you stiff, which shocked me when I was in my mid-20s.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, it's like, oh, you're going to try and make me move less and contain my movement. And now that's what I do to a lot of students. I try and contain them because, you know, most of us who are doing yoga these days, a lot of us who do yoga, we do it because we're told we're good at it. So we tend to be quite mobile to begin with anyway. We just don't realize. So a lot of my job is to hold people back. I'm constantly trying to hold people back. Not always in the sequence in the traditional way, but often in the expression of the pose. Like, come on, like put your attention in your back heel, put your attention in your buttock bones. You know, connect the buttocks to the heel so that you're not, you know, straining the hamstring attachments and so on. So yeah, for me.
So the purpose of holding people back is?
Well, it's safety and it's boundaries. And sometimes it's to establish some sort of rapport and trust.
Right. What's the boundaries?
What do you mean, what's the boundary?
Can you kind of elaborate on that term?
Well, I mean, in psychology, we all understand we have boundaries. There's a certain place I'm willing to go, and there's a certain place I'm not willing to go. And I mean, it's like me telling a young kid, okay, the boundary is here on the field. You're not allowed to go past it. You know, so I would say to, I don't know, I might have said to my children, you know, you're only allowed to go that far. Or when you get to the end of the street, you have to stop. You have to wait for me before you can cross the road. That kind of thing. Now, that doesn't mean to say people or children, especially in this context, might not cross the boundary a little bit. But I think actually by knowing where the boundary is, it gives them a feeling of safety. And I don't think it's that different for adults personally. If I know where the boundary is, I know where my limit is. Now, you know, you could talk about it in a whole number of different ways. You can talk about that in Ashtanga. What you allude to many times is the boundary as the edge of a sequence. I tend to think of it as the boundary as the expression of the posture. But there is also the sequence. There is also then the sequence spread out over weeks, months, or a season, or whatever it is. So there are boundaries in so many things. I mean, the boundary that was very helpful to learn through the traditional format of being in Mysore was the boundary of going to bed very early. And then the boundary of, you know, not taking in too much sensory stimulation, you know, or the boundary, you know, I've done plenty of Vipassana retreats where it's the boundary of, you know, you only eat morning and then your midday meal, and then there's you abstain from evening meal. So there's so many boundaries that you can create. And actually what they of course create is the boundary creates freedom. So the analogy is like, you know, you take away somebody's freedom and they're just stuck in the room playing trombone their entire childhood, you know, and then they turn into a fabulous trombonist. And you think, my God, the freedom of that playing of jazz or whatever it is. But that freedom is because the boundary was so tight. So in any discipline, and it only really works, I think, if you want to impose this discipline on yourself, but by narrowing the boundaries, it then enables you to really explore whatever it happens to be. So, I mean, for me, I often now teach on a day and say, okay, we'll just do standing poses. And by narrowing the sequence down and then narrowing down the actions in a particular set of poses, I personally feel the student comes away with more understanding of that small group of poses. And from a learning environment or a pedagogical environment, I feel that's very helpful because that's how I've learned now. That's one of the ways I've learned, which I feel is useful to then impart to others. But you see, if I were to try to And this is really challenging. I mean, I'm sure you'll, or other teachers will sympathise with this. There is a sense that we sometimes want to give people everything. We want to give them a whole practice, but we want to give them some teaching points. And I want to break down and stop and demonstrate a couple of bits. But there's just not the time. I mean, you might be able to teach a 3-hour workshop, but in an hour and a half, it's like, what can you cover? You just have to strip it back.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, I mean, elaborating further on that, what would you say, apart from the kind of the creation of a kind of holding structure or a sense of structure in which people can, find the boundaries of their own selves, I suppose, within the sequence? What would you say the role of yourself as a teacher is, or what would be a good teacher? I know it's a very vague and ambiguous term in your mind.
I don't think it's that. No, I think the main thing is that the great strength that what we could call the traditional Ashtanga method has offered me as a structure. Now that I've been studying yoga for a bit longer, so about 20 years, I'm a bit like Socrates, who realizes, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Because when you start studying with teachers who've done it for 40 or 50 years, you realize how vast the subject is. Now, what my senior teachers have done for me is they've said, go back to the beginning and look at this again. And they've said that repeatedly, every single time, and across the traditions, they've said, you don't know what you're doing, go back, start again. Go back, start again. It doesn't matter if it's Sharah or Adorit, start again. And every time I look a bit cocky, which happens sometimes, they're like, oi, check yourself, start again. Now, in the process of starting again, either I choose or a teacher shines a light on an area of dullness, darkness, ignorance, just a place where there's a lack of insight. And then in the framework and the structure of a postural practice, you have a choice. You can focus on the flowing movements of Surya Namaskar, consistent flowing pace. And just this morning, I was asking people to watch where the movement got choppy and sped up and jerky, and where they can slow the movement. Now, you could narrow that right down in a seated position and just look at the flow of the movement of the air. Is it coming in a jerky fashion, or is it smoother? So then it's pranayama practice, it's breathwork practice. But I could focus on the solidity and structure of standings. And for me, I do feel that beginners need to spend longer on standings. And I also feel that people who followed a more traditional Ashtanga methodology benefit a lot from, the standings. Just working at standings, that's the easiest place to work out the relationship between the major parts of the body. So I'm a big fan of that. But then you can go through all the categories of poses. You've got, you can focus on just forward bends, focus on just back bends, you can focus on just twists. And when I've studied with teachers like Christian Pisano, I've sometimes spent a weekend on just one aspect. So I've done, maybe it's just a weekend on forward bends. And then there's so many different ways to do it. Now, it's not all supported. A lot of it is supported to create this feeling of ease. But then a lot of it later would be like leg behind head variations, like you and me know from the third series. So it's like, you can take a category and you can go with it anywhere, but it'll have different colorations. So I feel there's tremendous benefit for teachers to show you how these things can be done in different ways. So there's...
And everyone has the accessibility to that, even if they're a stiff person without any physical range in the body particularly, they still have the capacity to develop and expand their practice in this manner, because obviously you have that ability to feel those parts of the body moving, because they do articulate.
Obviously, people who are less well-trained or less inclined won't necessarily be able to have as many variations, but ultimately, everyone can do every category. Well, not everyone. Most of the categories of poses, some form of back arch, some form of forward bend, some form of standing, some form of inversion. I think there's definitely ways for people to do it. I mean, I'm constantly showing people Kurmasana, where they sit on the edge of a chair and just go forward, and it takes the hamstrings out of the equation. So then I'll often use the phrase, you're doing this for the back, and you broaden the spinal muscles, you broaden the back. Now, a lot of people look at me a bit like, that's not the pose, but actually I'm like, I got tremendous insight from this variation of how to relax.
Why can't I pull my hamstrings up and lift my heels off the floor? They might be saying.
Yeah, so...
I'm not doing the shape as much as I could be.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So there are different ways, but for me, that's definitely the way I like to approach it as a student now and as a teacher. It doesn't suit everybody. Quite a lot of people lots of people, it doesn't suit them. There's a temperament for it. I have to say, I was more inclined to be doing some of this other approach, with more experience. So the thing that springs to mind is something I remember Christian Pisano teaching, which is saying in the beginning, practice is often stimulating. There's an obvious sense in the Ashtanga format of progression through a series. There's often a sense of satisfaction that you've completed a series. I mean, for me, it did feel like a milestone, for instance, to complete third series in Mysore. But it also felt like a milestone to complete second series. It was like, great, I was really happy to have done it.
Right.
I mean, actually, then the question is, can I maintain it? That's a whole other issue. But that did feel great. But then you see, But then there's a completely different approach later on, which is, if you've been doing this for more decades, and I'm not really saying this is somebody, I'm not trying to allude that I've been doing it for that long, but it's like when I'm in my third decade of practice, fourth decade, fifth decade of practice, and I certainly hope to be practicing postural yoga for many more decades. One of the things that Christian Pisano alludes to is it should become less and less stimulating, and the journey is more and more inward. And when you alluded to what was the benefit of alignment or what was the benefit of the supportive poses, I go much more inward when I do these slower sequences. So I do certain Iyengar sequences. There's a sequence called the emotional stability sequence at the back of Light on Yoga, and I studied that and practiced that a little bit with Alaric Newcomb. So when I practice that and I've got time, I think it's only about 12, maybe 10 or 12 poses or something. And yet I'll be doing it sometimes for 3 or 4 hours, holding poses, right, 20 minutes at a time. It's a completely different experience.
So when you say going inwards, you're not any longer concentrating, keeping your mind corralled by the alignment focus that you mentioned before.
What does
that mean?
You do let go. The form of the body is held. You roped the legs together, you supported the back on the bench, or you supported the pelvis on the bench. You supported the shoulders with bolsters, blankets, and so on. You even cover a lot of the time we wear a blindfold for that sequence. So, the awareness is very different. And you unravel parts of the body and tensions in different parts of what feels like the organs. And, you go swimming in the body. And I can only describe it as it's quite a sort of psychedelic experience. It's very different. Another way to describe it would be it's like I quite commonly would say I experience kind of transpersonal experience. I really do feel like I go somewhere else when I'm doing that type of practice. And I love it. And there are times when I said the same thing you asked, which is why don't I do that all the time? But I remember saying to Alaric quite early on, I feel so peaceful. I mean, I really felt so sublimely peaceful after doing some class or sequence with him. I said, God, I might just give up Ashtanga and do that all the time. And he said to me, and he said it keenly, he said it with a certain force, he said, the only reason you just benefited and are describing that delicious sort of juice or joy that you just described is because this morning you did a dynamic, strong practice. He said, you wouldn't be able to do that had you not been disciplined enough to have done what you did earlier, either in earlier years. So I really richly now value having both this dynamic side and this other side of practice.
Right. And do you get involved in the yoga philosophy at all? Does the yoga asana have a deeper underpinning for you?
Yeah, it has a huge, I mean, the two go hand in hand.
Right.
I wouldn't say I'm very skillful at teaching the philosophy so much. I do my best, but I find it more challenging. I tend to rely more heavily on readings. So I find excerpts from books and read That's one of the ways I share it. I also do contemplation. So I'll ask students questions and ask them to do journaling, and then get people in small groups and discuss things. But yeah, for me, the two go hand in hand. I mean, you have to have a meaning and a purpose to make sense of what we're doing. And for me, I suppose this sense of touching the transpersonal experience, or we could just go back to the question, who am I? That's a central thrust to working out. Well, working out's the wrong expression. But as to the motivation for why we keep practicing.
And does the asana practice facilitate that questioning or that questing?
Yeah, for me, it does. Yeah, for me, it absolutely does. I mean, I am a body. I have a body. I don't deny that, and I feel that we can kind of embody a certain wisdom tradition, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I feel very strongly about that. I mean, I've always, from early on in my practice, I've had a sitting practice. So I regularly sit. I regularly go on silent retreat in various different, Buddhist traditions. And yeah, I really value the Indian philosophy. I mean, it's like, just lately I've been reading Sophie's World again, and it's just so joyful, isn't it, to kind of ask yourself these questions. I mean, I love it. I really love it. I don't claim to be skillful in teaching that side of it. It's not my strong point, but yeah.
They weren't that keen on that book when I did my philosophy degree. Look down upon it, pretentious philosophers. No, it's a good book. It's a good introductory book. Look, just to lighten up, and I'm keen that you're probably busy. Can you just tell us? Well, I usually round it up by just saying, what are your inspirations outside yoga? And what is your, I say this every time and then people don't like the question, but what is your kind of guilty pleasure or your indulgence to yourself? So an inspiration, and just to give a rounded sense of anything you might be outside the yoga practice, sucking everything out of you.
That's a good question. It's quite a nice question. I enjoy learning. I mean, I know that sounds rudimentary, but again, Alaric, who the teacher I've alluded to several times, he mentioned something in positive psychology called the strengths test. It's quite well known. And in the strengths test, you can do this fairly sort of straightforward online quiz. And the idea in positive psychology is it's partly to identify your strengths, what you're good at, what you enjoy, and play to your strengths. Anyway, the thing that struck me when I did this, it was a few years back, is you come out with a list of, I think it's about 50 different aspects. But the number one for me was love of learning. So I like learning. I love it. I think it's why I teach, because I like learning stuff and imbibing it and then trying to share it with people. So the love of learning is strong for me. And at the moment, I'm still learning. I've been back at college studying counselling. I'm continuing with another couple of years of counselling training at the moment. And that's been really, really wonderful and insightful. So I really enjoy that aspect. That's what I'm currently sort of studying. I suppose, I wouldn't say it's a guilty pleasure, but I love music. I absolutely adore music. So I play music, dance, I play guitar.
What kind of stuff?
All sorts of stuff, Beatles songs, Bob Dylan songs, that's what I do when I'm noodling around on the guitar. Now that my daughter's 2 months old, I've got a captive audience. I've been learning to play all the songs from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, bluegrass type stuff. So I've been singing, I go down to the river to pray with my daughter, and I've been singing all those, it's Christian, biblical stuff, all that stuff. But it's been fun playing guitar and doing that sort of stuff. I've been playing a lot lately, so that's nice. And also I just devour books. I read and devour books when I'm not looking after the kids. Well, actually, I'm always looking after the kids, and then I'm always sort of slightly ignoring them as I read books.
The teenager's telling you to shut up on the guitar now. I'm getting to that age.
Yeah, but that's the thing. The teenagers are always like, "Oh my God, you're playing such miserable songs."
Yeah.
Those sad love songs.
Yeah. So there you go. I would say, I would try and think of someone that they would say, "Oh, you play that for us, Dad," but I don't know any modern stuff. I'll stick with the Dylan. You never need to move past that. All right. Well, it's been a wonderful and a pleasurable experience having this chat with you, Joey. And thanks for your time, eh?